dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you need the wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you need the wrong or right.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Dungeon Master of None. It's just me today. That's Rob, your faithful Dungeon Master. Matt and I, being the consummate professionals that we are, did not plan very well for this week, and so are not going to be in the same place at the same time to record even digitally. So I am going to do this episode solo to keep the content flowing. And because there are a number of things that I would like to talk about that Matt never wants to talk about, and because he's not the boss of me, I'm going to do this and upload a piece of bonus content because you got to have that content flowing. So this is going to be kind of a short one. It will just be me, but this will be an opportunity for me to talk about something that is kind of interesting and that you might not know a whole lot about unless you were, for example, a hyper nerd on the internet in the early aughts, which some of you are, but many of you are not. And hopefully this is useful and will be elucidating for you. Some of what I'm about to talk about has been influential on the role-playing game community, and I think it's a little worthwhile trip down memory lane. So buckle up for a little bit of theory time with Rob. So what I want to talk about today is something that's called GNS theory. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it is based on sort of a general idea about how games are structured. There is a previous threefold model that is sometimes called GNS, and that stands for Game Drama Simulation. And these are understood in the GNS model as the three paradigms of role-playing. So these are the three ways that you can approach gaming, as it were. Now, bear with me. I know this is going to sound reductive, but we're getting somewhere. This is part of a long tradition of trying to understand how games work and what makes them fun. It is something that game designers in other fields have been doing for a long time, but hasn't been taken super seriously in RPGs, mostly because we in the RPG space lack the breadth and depth of funding and the sort of diversity of thought and depth of the field to make it happen. Really, there's just not enough people running around to start talking about deep narrative theory. Our RPG theory you will run into a lot for sure, but I don't think it's particularly well developed. And I think that most designers are going to probably agree with me there. There's a lot of work to be done. But around the early 2000s, there were some new attempts to sort of quantify and make sense of how people played games. And one of the main attempts was made by a person named Ron Edwards. Now, Ron Edwards is a game designer. He's best known for Sorcerer, the RPG, but Ron also is well known for having created or partially managed the Forge forums. These were the early days of the internet, back when people still used forums, and they were a place for hardcore game designer types to discuss role-playing games. And a lot of where the conversation was happening was generally on places like the Forge. Remember, the hobby is still very small at this time. This is before 4th edition. It is well before 5th edition. It is before Critical Role, before Stranger Things, before things blew up. So this is still very much a small space. And a lot of what was published on the Forge was largely theoretical or systems-based or articles and other attempts at theory to make sense of the game. And out of this came the GNS model. So I mentioned the threefold model previously, and like I said, trying to make sense of gaming from a sociological or anthropological or theoretical perspective is not new. A lot of you have probably heard terms like ludonarrative being thrown around a lot. Ludo, all sorts of things, and I think this is getting more traction as games of all sorts get larger and larger. But it had not really been applied particularly well to role-playing games up until this point, and remains not particularly well applied, but we'll get to that. But the GDS, game drama simulation model, arose from an even earlier forum that was largely populated by hyper-nerds who spent most of the time yelling at each other. But from the GDS model was produced the GNS theory. And GNS stands for Gamist, Narrativist, Simulationist. Now, you probably have already figured out what this theory is about based on what I've said so far, but to break it down, Ron and the other people who held to GNS theory believed that you could break down the motives and desires of role players into three categories. The categories being gamist behavior, which reinforces competition and challenge, narrativist behavior, which reinforce story and theme, simulationist behavior, which reinforce experience and celebration of source material. This is mostly concerned with players' social interactions, right? This has to do with how players approach the game and each other. And you're probably coming to understand why this was a problem, but it was an attempt by Ron and others to sort of put some guardrails and make sense of games, understand why people play. Ron had a theory that, Edwards had a theory that most people who play role-playing games did not enjoy playing them, which at the time may have been close to true. It was a hard time to be a gamer. But this was an attempt to divide players into categories so that you could better understand what made them tick and what they would enjoy. So, gamist means that you are mostly concerned with succeeding on tougher challenges and against tougher opponents, and you may not be terribly interested in the background or the story even, or really the narrative. This is the archetypal power gamer might be a gamist. Dungeons & Dragons itself is often considered to be a gamist role-playing game. I think that 5th edition has done a better job of getting away from the gamist roots, and as I will discuss later in theory time, I don't think that this is a particularly useful way of thinking about any one RPG, but use this as sort of a barometer. A better example is CRPGs, of course, are gamist, as are most MMOs. Most very structured board games, even if they have a fantastical or a role-playing element, are gamist. And of course, the detractors of this like to point out that that gamists are only interested in how to win. They're only concerned with being as powerful as possible and achieving victory over challenges to the best of their ability. Narrativist, the second in the GNS triad, refers to players that want to further a dramatic story or address a central theme. So this does not mean that the mechanics of the game need to act directly on the story. It just means that the player is most interested in interacting with the themes of the narratives of the game. So a combat example is a narrativist might want to further the story more than they would want to just win, right? They might want to do something in a dramatic way. They might spare a enemy if it were dramatic, or kill one that otherwise they might have spared. They might be more concerned with going after a terrible rival rather than the most dangerous opponent, even perhaps to the detriment of themselves and their allies. Many indie role-playing games are designed specifically to be narrativist games, and you've heard us talking about this. Of course, Dogs in the Vineyard is a great example. I would say that Fate and a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games are very narrative-based. Burning Wheel is in some senses a narrativist game, though it has other elements. But this is really just a way of thinking about players and their motivations. And Ron Edwards was very, very clearly motivated by... he wanted to suggest that players would get the most enjoyment out of narrativist games, and that narrativist games were the best way to sort of take the industry and the hobby. There was some disagreement on this point. The last of these sort of three ideas of play is called simulationist. And this is, I have often used the word verisimilitude. It just means the game or the player is intended to, or the idea is to simulate accurately how things might happen. And this often involves a very, very gritty, crunchy combat systems. So GURPS is a good example of a simulationist game. You can get really, really precise in GURPS, especially with something like martial arts that even requires like a whole other source book. Certain parts of Burning Wheel, like the combat dueling system and the Words of Fate system, or not Words of Fate, the Duel of Wits system, get very, very simulationist. Call of Cthulhu, though it is very story-based and narrative, can also be seen as a simulationist game with a strong focus on narration. So these are the three main ideas, right? And there were a lot of sub-concepts and discussion within this, and I would encourage you to search for GNS yourself if you think this is interesting, and do a little bit of research and do the reading. But the sort of long and short of it is that this became influential very briefly and then immediately flamed out. And the problem was that Ron Edwards and a lot of his, I don't want to say acolytes, that sounds critical, but the people who agreed with him wanted this to be sort of the be-all and end-all of understanding role-playing games. They wanted it to basically quantify every way of play, and it was clearly written with an agenda. Ron had a clear favorite and believed that this understanding games in this fashion was a way to support his style of play. One thing that you cannot do with GNS is sort of lump every single player and every single game into a neat category. And I definitely don't think that it is useful for creating an actual broad theory of role-playing games. But I do like the GNS theory for a couple of reasons, and I think that taken away from the early aughts flame war, that there's some useful lessons to be drawn from this. So once again, I would encourage you to research this and read some of the original posts. I will have a link to the old school forge.net, the Forge, whatever it is. It's now on indierpgs.com. Articles about GNS, and you can read them for yourself. But I like the general idea behind gamist, simulationist, and narrativist. I think that every player has a little bit of each in them, and I definitely think that every game has a little bit of each in them. And there are much more sophisticated ways of talking about what motivates players to play games. And if I have to do another theory time by myself, or perhaps if Matt decides that this is worth pursuing, we'll discuss those. But this is a good sort of baseline for thinking about how you approach your games and how your players approach your games. So Gamist is a really easy one to understand, right? We all know or have known a power gamer. We all know somebody who treats D&D like a video game, or we may not know about somebody, but that's a pretty easy to understand concept, right? And not every player is going to be 100% of one thing. Your player who approaches the game with a very real problem-solving mentality may be playing their character to the best of their role-playing ability. Similarly, you can have an extremely strongly narratively driven character that also happens, a player that also happens to be very, very excited about being mechanically powerful. And you may have a player that is very, very interested in how the world ought to work, but also has elements of the other too. These are all different approaches, and these are not the only ways to approach role-playing games, but I do think that most players and most games can be understood within this framework, as long as you are not using it to try to place a real concrete label on something. There is not a single role-playing game that is purely simulationist, purely gamist, purely narrativist. But a lot of players and a lot of designers do have certain affinities, and they like a certain type of play a lot more. And I think that when you think about how you are going to run your games, and when you think about what makes your players happy, I think that sort of chunking things into these big three categories is potentially useful, especially if you are trying to make sense of a lot of different information. We will talk, hopefully, about some ways to narrow this down in the future, and frankly, these theories are not super useful in general because you are dealing with human beings and very complicated systems. But I know that I am an analytical thinker, and I know that a lot of you are probably analytical thinkers, and whether or not this is an accurate model, it has helped me to sort of think about how my games work. So when you are approaching your own games, and you think this might be a good way to put some rails or provide some categories for your thinking and for your players, just take a look at what motivates you and what motivates them when they come to the table. And don't try to put anybody in any boxes, but see who is most interested in the mechanical bits, see who is most interested in the story bits, and see who is most interested in the way that the game works. I had a player who was gravely upset with me because of the way that a animated object behaved in one of my games. From a mechanical perspective, the animated object could do exactly what I had it do. I had it. It was a table that folded in half to snap him like an alligator. That was a narrative description that I used to make the scenario a little bit more exciting. From a mechanical gamist perspective, there was no reason why it could not make an attack against a player character that was standing on top of it. But from a simulationist perspective, the player struggled with the idea of a table that was previously solid bending in half. And from that point onward, I made sure to be a little bit more conscientious of how I was describing things so that they would fit better with that sort of understanding of the world. You are not going to be able to do this perfectly in every RPG, but I think that when you run into problems, I think trying to step outside of yourself a bit and make sense of how other people are approaching the game or how the game is meant to be played can be useful. This is also a good way to sort of identify what role-playing games do poorly. D&D, as I have mentioned, is largely gamist, less so 5th edition, but definitely 3.5. It struggles with the narrative elements. I think this was my least favorite part of 4th edition, was that the game felt so gamist and so in some ways simulationist that there was very little flexibility for narrative. Other people didn't mind this as much, and I think that this has to do with how comfortable you are bending the rules or homebrewing, but it was something that I struggled with the entire time. So hopefully this has been constructive and useful for you. I didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but just know that if you look into this, you'll find a lot of very angry people, and that the way that GNS was presented was sort of as a binding, concrete theory, and a way to make sense of gaming entirely. And this was unpopular. It seemed to a lot of people like pseudo-intellectualism. It seemed to overreach. And this is all pretty true. But I do think that there is some pretty good stuff here. It's useful, and I think that it's helpful for us to think theoretically about role-playing games from time to time. And there are better theories than this, and there are better, studies of gaming in general, but I don't know that they have been applied particularly well or constructively to role-playing games as a whole, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And so if this is something that interests you, go back to the roots, go back to GNS and think about it, and I would strongly encourage you to use it as a way to start thinking about your own game and your players, but not as a framework of any merit. Just much like you might use the philosophy of Thales, to better understand how we have reached the point that we're at now, or how you might, read Newton's laws to get a better sense of how science has advanced. This is a good way to take a look at how we have gotten to where we are in the in the role-playing game community, and how far the hobby has come. So hopefully this was useful and interesting. Sorry for the baby episode, but we will see if Matt and I can't get together and maybe talk a little bit more about this, talk about some of the more advanced theories, some of the more robust approaches to role-playing games. And if you have any questions, as always, email us at dmofnone@gmail.com, at us on Twitter at dmofnone, and keep rolling them dice.